Jim Henderson describes himself as a sort of spiritual anthropologist. He's very interested in how beliefs affect behavior and how behavior affects beliefs, which is what brought him to the Midwest after hearing stories about an unlikely friendship between a rabbi, an imam, and a preacher in Peoria.
One of the things that interests me is human beings' capacity to what I call stay in the room with difference. So I'm curious about how you've learned to talk about that.
As I reached out to Daniel, there was a sense of I want to, and there was
Was it an adventure for you?
There was adventures, a curiosity, there was a respect, and then I very quickly gravitated to him. We connected personally. There was just a genuine friendship there. But to be honest, there was much more trepidation, nervousness when it came to Camille, because Muslims were so otherized in my mind. And there were certain narratives that I had come to believe about Islam, and because I didn't know a Muslim, there was still this concern that most Christians would hold on to, that while most Muslims don't outwardly support or do terrorism, that there was this belief that secretly they're okay with it.
Right.
Because Islam is spread by the sword. That is a common belief. And I'll let you interact, because I know you're just chomping the bit.
No, that's fine.
But those narratives were embedded in my mind, and it was hard for me to overcome those, because even as I'm moving towards you, there's still this what if.
I try not to take that personally, because I know, these people don't know me. They just look at the word Muslim as like a, label for a certain kind of person who looks a certain way.
I know Muslims who, today the reality, because of the rampant Islamophobia, they have changed their names. Because there is a real sense of fear, of being stigmatized out there when you're known to be a Muslim.
I know a lot of Muslims who don't cover their heads. I didn't used to cover my head until 2 years ago.
Many people have genuine concern that, okay, maybe I can only go so far being visibly Muslim.
It's always at the back of my mind that, this person, whoever is saying something about me or my religion, just does not know any better.
It's not an easy thing in the Muslim world to invite a rabbi to come and speak for 4 weeks in your community. He gave me no requirements. He gave me no topics that I needed to make sure I didn't cover or anything like that. He said, you come and you teach whatever it is you want to teach about Judaism.
I taught about Christianity for 4 weeks. And Camille even said to me, he said, Jim, you can share whatever you want to share. And then he jokingly said, you can even share the gospel. And I did.
There is no fear here, right? There's no concern that, oh my God, somebody is going to say something and we are going to be offended. Christians believe Jesus is the Son of God. It's in the Quran. You know what I mean? So it's already there. It's not like they're going to say something we have never heard before.
And that really was the beginning of my relationship to the broader Muslim community in Peoria, because it meant wherever I went from then on, I was running into people that I knew, that I recognized, who knew me. So we had this level of trust that was already there.
The freedom to be able to go into a mosque, not having to water down what I believe about the scriptures or the story or the life of Jesus. It was a beautiful thing.
People loved it, It's almost like a world religion class. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like a world religion class. There's nothing wrong with knowing about other religions.
There are vast groups of people who are judging all of Islam by this tiny fraction of extremists. And for me, I guess, so I've heard the analogy equating all Muslims with ISIS is like equating all Christians with Westboro Baptist. And that's not a hard concept for me. There's a space in between where I sit and where Westboro Baptist sits, where it's still hard, I think, for people raised like us who maybe haven't had the experiences we have to not otherize Muslims, to not operate out of fear.
I'm not saying that I speak for 1.6 billion Muslims. But, the fact is that the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful. That's just a fact.
I'm really sick of people asking Camille to denounce ISIS. I'm just really sick of it. Because, you know what? Camille's mosque has denounced ISIS over and over and over and over again, and there are, 35,000 people in ISIS and 1.6 billion Muslims? And yet, over and over again, he gets asked wherever he goes, how come you won't deny ISIS? How come you won't point out that ISIS is evil? Aren't you really just supporters of ISIS? I'm just sick of the question. And, it goes against everything else I've said. I know that what I have to do is sit with the question. I have to sit with the people. But I don't want to do that. When they ask Camille that, I just want to stand up and say, this is bigotry. This question itself is bigotry. This question itself is racism. It's Islamophobia. And I just want to shake the person. And I know that's the wrong response. And in fact, all of the work that we've done together is about not responding that way. But there's something about that question that just gets to me.
In 2010, we had written a letter that we sent to the mosque about denouncing a pastor that was going to be burning the Quran publicly.
The guy in Florida.
Yeah. And so we wrote a letter saying basically that we do not believe this is the way of Jesus. We think that this is inappropriate. We apologize on behalf of Christians, and we just want you to know that this does not speak for us, and we do not think it's consistent with the way of Christ. And the feedback that came back to us was, thank you very much for this. And then when I talked to some individual people, their comment to me was this: thank you for the letter, because we just assumed that a majority of Christians supported this pastor in Florida. And my response was, are you kidding me? But in the mosque, all they see is what's being portrayed in the media, and they make the assumption that this guy is speaking for a majority of Americans and a majority of Christians. And once again, that became another watershed experience for me when I said, oh, we do the same thing to them. We see news of terrorism, and then we project that on the whole of Muslims, the same way that people in the mosque thought that this guy in Florida was speaking for all Christians.
I understand history is basically just moving in one of two directions. Either we are moving in a direction of including more and more people in the project of us, or we are moving in a direction of including more and more people in the project of them.
So what does it look like to include more and more people in the project of us? Jim Henderson has been watching people work this problem for a long time, and he believes there's a common pattern among those who are making progress. 3 practices they all work on, whatever language they may use to describe what they're doing. They are unusually interested in each other. They stay in the room with difference, and they don't compare their best with each other's worst. Henderson is careful to call these practices because he hasn't seen anyone get it 100% right. They just keep working on it. They keep doing everything they can for as long as they can because they want to get it right.
It strikes me in reflection that the one precondition that we do have is that to sit down at our table, you be as interested in hearing the story of the other as you are interested in telling your own story.
Sitting on a panel with Rabbi Daniel and Imam Mufti, and the question is, what do you all believe about Jesus? Of the 3 Abrahamic faiths, you all have something to say about Jesus. And of course, Imam Mufti has a lot to say about Jesus. Muslims believe he's a great prophet. And of course, I want to talk about Jesus. Rabbi Daniel, meanwhile, goes, as a Jew, I have nothing to say about Jesus. And he puts down the mic, and it's hilarious, right? Because Jesus means nothing to a Jew, like nothing. And so Imam Mufti and I had this great conversation. Later on, we're walking to lunch, and Rabbi Daniel and I are talking about another theological issue. And he and I are like going back and forth, and he's like, tell me, well, Leviticus believes da-da-da-da. I'm like, I am so into that. I want to understand how a rabbi interprets Leviticus. I want to know how you interpret that. That matters to me. Like, that's a great conversation. And Imam Mufti he doesn't care what we're doing as we talk about Leviticus. And then we're sitting at lunch. This is all like in the matter of like an hour. We're sitting at lunch, and they're talking about head coverings. And I'm thinking, man, I don't care about this conversation at all. And it's funny when you get into these conversations how it shifts and moves, and there's times where you feel affinity here, and then here, and then here, and I walked away from all that thinking I was so enriched by each one of those. I was enriched by those interactions, and it's just a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
I thought I knew a lot about what Christians believed in or what the Jews believed in, but that's really not true, I found, to my surprise. Sitting together with people of different faiths and just basically listening to what they have to say and like telling them what you have to say just really opens up your eyes to the humanity and the side of people that you just would probably just classify as Jews or Christians, and so just the tender sides of them, or like just the normal human sides of them.
It's so easy to fear the unknown, and so if you don't go out and educate yourself and meet a Muslim, talk to your Muslim neighbor, talk to your Christian neighbor, and get to know your Jewish friends, you'll be bound to living in ignorance and in fear of the unknown.
Pastor Jim shared his apprehension and fear, at the beginning. And what I was most shocked about is when the imam came here and spoke to us, and he gave us actual verses out of the Quran and showed us that they live in peace and they don't want to harm anyone, and that just like there's bad Christian people, there's bad, Muslim people, and that do things that they shouldn't, but they're certainly not supporting or backing any of that. So I just think being educated before, I guess the only experience or knowledge I had of Muslim people was what I saw on the news with the bad Muslim people. And now my mind was opened to what they really stand for and what they really believe.
I can't think of a better solution for coexistence than open conversation, because being able to remember your conversation with the Muslim you talk to in school, or the Muslim you've known from work, just being able to put that face to it, it helps clear up that misconception that often gets put out there on Muslims and Jews alike.
We really are discovering insights about ourselves and about our own traditions that we had no clue about. Hearing Jim talk about Jesus, hearing Camille talk about the pre-Muslim world and then the Muslim world post-Muhammad, it's given me an insight into the world that the Talmud is written in, an insight into the world where Jews took refuge when they were fleeing Christendom.
One of the beautiful things that Daniel taught me about the Torah is that the most common commandment in there is this idea of accepting the foreigner or stranger, the alien, because you are the foreign stranger, alien. I have never, ever, ever, ever heard an evangelical emphasize that as the most common theme in the Torah. But my Jewish friend brings out meat from that text that allows me to read the Torah with a completely different set of eyes.
Likewise with Jim, seeing his faith and the way that he talks about God has really been transformative for me. A lot of Jews are uncomfortable with God language, and yet hearing the comfort and the ease that Jim discusses the divine with has really been heart-opening for me, and has given me an ease as well that I will continue to be grateful for.
I think many people assume that to be in an interfaith conversation or be in an interfaith friendship, it has to come down to some lowest common denominator. And I've been a part of those things too, and they're really unfulfilling.
We're not on that path. We are very much about, we have differences here, and we're not only talking about what we have in common, we're able to press in, we're able to ask difficult questions, we're able to dig down.
I give a lot of credit to our approach to Camille. The first time we sat down at coffee, I immediately wanted to jump in and do a program with the Jewish community and the Muslim community. And what Camille told me is, first we have to build a relationship. And he meant the two of us. That first there had to be that trust, that respect, but really that relationship. And that's really become our approach in the Peace for Peoria movement, which is first build the relationship, and then once you already know the other human being and already care about the human being, then you can hear the content that disagrees with your own content and still stay at the table.
I think that's something that they all taught us, that maybe we weren't sure about, that you are sometimes a little leery of people who are different from you. And they kind of broke down those barriers and made us all a little more comfortable with that.
I had a comment on my blog asking the question, so to have these kind of friendships, you pretty much have to lay down everything you believe, right? And my response was absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't expect my wife to lay down what she believes for us to have a relationship. We don't agree about things sometimes, and we keep being in relationship with each other.
I ended up in a conversation with a dear friend of mine right after the Orlando shootings. And she was pushing back on me a little bit about how I could be standing with the Muslim community at a time when she felt the Muslim community had some guilt in the shooting that happened, right? In terms of, and I think all three Abrahamic faiths might have some cheshbon nefesh, have some internal looking to do about how the way that we have spoken about the LGBT community leads to violence and has led to violence historically.
Camille and I had a long discussion about Iran and, Shiite, Muslims and different viewpoints in American foreign policy. And we're able to have that dialogue and say, but what about this? But what about that? We can push into those subjects and have disagreement and dialogue without becoming defensive or becoming angry at each other.
So I started talking to my friend and responding to her questions as best I could, responding about what I knew about the Muslim community, the Muslim American community, and the LGBT community, and all the things that I've heard from Camille and the conversations we've had. And she looked at me and she said, but there's just no way that any of us can ever address these issues straight on with a Muslim. And I looked back at her and I said, well, I've talked about this with Camille dozens of times, and I've talked about issues that are much more challenging than this dozens of times. And that to me is the beauty of our relationship, that for the three of us, we don't shy away from the challenging pieces. We don't shy away from the difficult questions. And we're continuing to learn about each other and continuing to discover things that we like and that we don't like about each other and each other's traditions.
While I talk about commonalities that we have, I want to be very clear that we have clear differences and we're not watering those down, we're not avoiding those. I believe that's an area of great strength and hopefully something that other people can find inspiration from.
We feel so comfortable and so at peace knowing that we can ask each other these questions, whatever they are, the places where our values differ or where they might differ or where we don't know. The difficult questions are what bring us together and really form the center of our bond is the true interest, the true curiosity about the hard points, about the places where we diverge from each other. That's really the model that I hope that we can share and the model that we hope we can spread. Dialogue has to be about coming together as human beings, and once we are there as human beings, once we see the sacred in the other, the image of the divine in the other, then we can begin to have the conversations about the difficult places, on the places where I think you're wrong and you think I'm wrong. But because we care about each other, because we love each other, we can have those conversations.
My friendship with Jim Powell and with Rabbi Daniel Bogart is not based on agreement. We can differ on some of our most fundamental beliefs. And at the same time, we can be tolerant with one another, accept one another, and respect our differences.
When I say Camille is my friend, when I say Jim is my friend, I mean it. It's not a professional friendship, it's a real friendship. And so all of the work that we're doing, I believe, is about that. It's about just saying that the friend of my friend is my friend, or should be my friend.
I think that the default position for Jews is to reach out, and certainly is for our congregation, to reach out to people in need, other religions, other cultures. But because of what happened at 9/11, people just got scared. And that fear interfered with our natural desires to see people as people.
The story for me starts really on 9/11.
I remember I was working in Chicago Board of Trade. I remember the day.
Like everybody else, just, we were in shock. We were watching the events, my wife and I.
Nobody really knew what happened. The news was still pouring in. And then what I remember is they said, go back home because we had Sears Tower like literally in our backyard. And I remember walking past Sears Tower because I had to take Chicago Metro. And I remember just staring up at Sears Tower in fear. Oh my God, something might happen. I was shaking.
I remember watching an interview on television that night, and there was a professor of a university that was saying that this is not representative of Islam as a whole, that it's really a religion of peace. And I remember having a visceral reaction to that, just feeling very angry, saying, that's just not true. That's just not true.
Next day was work as usual. And I think that was one of the scariest days of my life, because these are the same people in Metra, right, who I used to go to work with every day. But I really felt standing apart.
Most of what I'd heard about Islam was, of course, from Christians talking about Islam. A lot of it was straw man arguments that had been set up. A lot of them were proof texting specific verses from the Quran. And so I had those assumptions already in my mind that I felt I knew what Muslims believed. And so in my mind, the actions of these individuals represented the whole of all Muslims.
I don't know if maybe everybody was looking at me. I was too scared to even think like that, but I do feel that was the day when I started feeling like an outsider.
Christians are afraid that Muslims are going to come over and try to take over America and implement Sharia law and all this kind of stuff. But you know how afraid many of my Muslim friends are?
Whenever you hear of a terrorist attack all over the world, the first thought that you have before you even can mourn the victims is, please God, like, do not let this be a Muslim. You know, you're kind of like stripped of that right to like mourn before you have to like fear.
It's tragically ironic because there's this demonization of the Muslim community as being all-powerful, as being this great threat to the American dream, to the American promise, to the American future, when the reality is this is a vulnerable small community that's being targeted by those who hold the most privilege and those who have the most power.
Whether we're black or white or Hispanic or Muslim or Christian, that's part of our whole country. That's why we're as strong as we are. And for anybody to be living in fear because of their religious beliefs or because of where they come from and what their culture is incredibly sad and scary, and it should not happen in Peoria or anywhere.
Since I started covering my head, like I've been called, I don't know if I should say that on the camera, but I've been called like a fucking towel head. And you know, like it's just senseless, and you know that. And you want to laugh, but like it's also really disturbing because these people don't know you as a person, and you know, they have so much hatred.
There's always been a sense amongst American Jews that once we start going down this path of otherization, where we're otherizing more and more groups, that it's not long until Jews become the next other. So there's a self-serving piece to it, as well as a really just a moral piece, that this is wrong, this sort of language.
Before the election season started, before all the debates and, you know, all the candidates, you know, exercising their freedom of speech, I don't really think that we saw you know, hate speech which was this intense. But in the end, I do still feel like in this city, like, you know, there's more love than there's hate. Hope I'm not proven wrong.
I was talking to a Christian that does work with Muslims, and he says, whenever people say, well, you're just wrong about this, or you're wrong about Muslims, he says, my response is always, do you have any Muslim friends? And he said, never one time have I had a person that says you're wrong about Muslims that has a Muslim friend or even knows a Muslim. You know what? If I don't ever interact with a Muslim, I don't know how scared they are. I only know how scared I am.
On one hand, the kingdom of God is out there.
We need to be sending a message. If I do not know, you know, other religion, I'd rather not speak about it before I learn about it.
For so many of us, we don't see Muslims, we don't see individuals. All we see are these sort of imagined realities of what we think Islam is, or what Muslims are, or this grand conspiracy, or whatever it is. And so for me, the real goal is first and foremost to demythologize Muslim Americans and just begin to see them as Americans who are Muslim, who are engaged in the same project of America that we are engaged in, who are not primarily concerned in their everyday lives with ISIS, but with, oh my God, is my 16-year-old going to drive okay? And how are my daughter's grades? And how am I going to afford to pay this? I mean, human beings.
I think that we need to recover what it is when Jesus calls us to love, that love is the highest ethic. And we like to say that, you know, the greatest commandment, we all know the greatest commandment is love. But when it gets down to brass tacks, it's specifically to love your enemies. No, you don't get any applause for loving your kids and your wife and your friends. The real work is in then how do we love those even if we perceive them as enemies? And I'm clear to say I don't perceive Muslims or Jews or any other religion as my enemy. But even if you do, even if you believe in a geopolitical sphere, hey, there are enemies in the world, we're called to love them in tangible ways. And at the minimum, that theological commitment to love requires me to be in conversation.
You start hate, this is like a seed of a weed. Weed grows very fast, so is hate, you know. And love does not grow that fast because love needs a lot of tenderness, a lot of care.